Hey everyone, and welcome back to the second episode in this series of RxJS Patterns in React. Today we have Chris, of course, who is co-hosting, and you can follow him on Twitter. Chris, how do you say your Twitter handle? Do you ever say it out loud?
I just spell it out.
KTRZ underscore.
Chris.
And then we also have Jay Phelps. Hi, Jay.
Hello.
And you can follow him on Twitter at _Jay Phelps or JP Helps if you need to remember how to spell that. Jay is co-author of redux-observable, works at Netflix, and has done a lot of other amazing things, and was previously on the RxJS Core Team.
Yep. Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so we did end up the previous part with Ben, with using some custom hooks to make our manage our RxJS observables in a more composable manner. And since you, Jay, are a co-founder or a founder of redux-observables,
Yeah.
I wanted to maybe ask you more about this topic in this part. I was basically wondering if what are the best practices to use RxJS with React, and when is the right when is what makes it the right project to use them, and what is the caveat here when people shouldn't maybe use them?
Sure. Yeah. So there's three pieces to it. So there's React itself, Redux and RxJS, if we're talking about redux-observable, the library. And so if we're talking just RxJS itself, the biggest, there's the obvious caveat that I'm sure Ben gave about that, RxJS is a domain-specific language, and it's lazy and all sorts of, it's very functional programming, kind of more complicated sort of thing. So with great power comes great responsibility, Spider-Man. So in the sense of just be careful that you don't overuse it, and because some people just really, it'll burn them out and just create a nightmare. That being said, it does do some things, better than the alternatives and easier once you actually understand it. So with that caveat in mind, if you are using Redux and you have a good reason to use Redux, and there's a lot of articles online, people have written about why you should or should not use Redux and when you should use it. Redux is great for what it's made for. Its primary intention about needing global state that needs to be shared amongst disparate parts of the tree. But what it's not great for is I have a really fairly simple app that just fetches data from the server and then displays it, and that's it. It's way overkill to be throwing in all sorts of complicated technologies just for simple things. But if you have a true application that requires lots of global state and stuff like that, Redux can be very handy on that. So if you have decided I need to use Redux for some reason, and you've decided that you've got some reason why you have some sort of complicated async side effects, redux-observable can basically allow you to combine Redux and RxJS, and then it's not actually specific to React. It could be used with Angular or with Vue or whatever you want, really. Anything you can use Redux with, you can use redux-observable. And the principle of it is that Redux is mentally a stream of actions, right? You dispatch an action, you are emitting through that stream, that action. And then if anyone's listening to that action, listening to that stream, they're tapping that stream, they can take they can do something in response to that action. And since RxJS is all about streams, we basically model it off of that. You have a function which we call an epic, which is called it's called once when the application boots up, with a stream of actions, right? You've got an observable of actions. And so then you can do, you can do your filtering based, you can filter based on what action type it is. And then in response to that action type, you can, if it matches, you can go and, do a switch map to go make an AJAX request. Or if it's like a WebSocket, like that's one really common thing with redux-observable is if you need a WebSocket, complicated multicasting, all sorts of stuff, that actually is a great use case for redux-observable in RxJS, because it can make things like you're going to basically invent some sort of pub sub system anyway in that sort of scenario. So might as well use documented standardized tools and Redux dev tools and stuff like that for that kind of scenario. So there's also, if you're familiar with NGRX effects, which is like the Angular, basically Rob Wormald and Ben Lesh and I were friends, all living in the Bay Area at the time. And I think we were I'm trying to remember what conference we were at. We were at some conference, and we all basically concurrently figured out this pattern, for lack of a better word, that we've been doing, like we've been experimenting with. And, they decided to go specific for Angular because then you can provide a whole bunch of extra Angular specific patterns and tooling. And we decided, because we weren't using Angular at the time at least, and we decided to make something generic, right? So there's like, it's one of those things where it's like, if you are using Angular, I actually would recommend you use NGRX effects because you're gonna get better documentation, better support, better tooling, those sorts of things. And if you end up leaving and Angular and switching to React or something like that, converting NGRX effects to redux-observable is not actually that hard. There are some cases, like over the years, we've diverged in some ways. We've tried to come back, like we've collaborated a few times and standardized on some things, but there's some edge casey things that you may hit. For example, how actions that your epic is conceptually a stream of input actions and then a stream of output actions. So any actions that your epic emits then get dispatched, right? So how to say this, when they get dispatched, like what way they're scheduled, and this is getting really complicated, what way they're scheduled is different between redux-observable and NGRX effects. At least the last time I looked, it was different. And I can't explain how, because I would literally have to show you a visualization of the scheduling. The point being is that we both have different opinions on what's more intuitive, what works, what people assume happens, even though they don't really think really about what the implications of what happens is. And so, for the most part, most people don't hit those differences, and so it's not that big a deal. Yeah, so I'll kind of yield the thread for a second, and if there's any questions, and otherwise I can keep talking about it.
Yeah, well, it's nice that you mentioned NGRX because for me, as a person coming more from the Angular background, this was kind of like the entry point. I was like, okay, I know this pattern in Angular. How can I transfer my knowledge into React world?
Yeah.
And redux-observable seemed like a reasonable tool to do that. Because the only other thing that I've seen which was nice, looked nice for me, was Redux Saga, but that requires yet another concept to be learned from, which is generators, which I think that people don't fully understand in general.
No, absolutely. And so they have a concept. Redux Saga has a concept of sagas as well. The term saga comes from academia, and the definition of it is fairly loose. And so our definition of saga and their definition of saga, there's similarities when you look at it from a high level, but then when you go and drill down into in the actual specifics, like, for example, Redux Saga, they're all about effects as data. Like they're more like algebraic effects, if anyone's familiar with that. It's a fancy word for something that's actually not that complicated. In the sense of you're basically not performing the side effects yourself. You're basically telling a runtime to perform the side effects. The generator yields an object that says, oh, here's a description of the IO, the input output I want you to perform, and then when it's done, come back to me. And our redux-observable is not that. You truly perform what you like. Basically, once you're in the epic, it's all up to you to do whatever you want. If you wanted to, you could just say, new observable, and inside there use whatever you wanted. You could start using promises if you really wanted to. It's weird to do so, but you could. But yeah, like I think it's a great, if you are already familiar with NGRX and NGRX effects, I think it's a great transition. And especially if you had decided, not that I'm advocating for this, but if you had decided, oh, as a team, we want to switch, actually, we want to migrate our app from one to the other. It's not going to be a copy paste sort of thing as trivial, but it actually wouldn't be super, super hard in a vast majority of cases if you've already doubled down on NGRX effects and stuff like that. It wouldn't be super hard to do the migration. Yeah, so where it really like basically with Redux and redux-observable, it's going to be a lot of boilerplate. That's the biggest complaint that people make, is there's a lot of indirection. And so if you're not, that's where I was kind of stressing about, like, not using it just for the sake of using it, unless you really needed to, unless there was a good reason to use it, because you're just going to get frustrated if all you're doing is dispatching an action, fetching from the server, and then updating the store, and that's it. Like, if that's all you ever do, which is just read data, it's like very simple to do app sort of stuff, it's a lot of indirection for no benefit. So it's really great for those just very complicated sort of situations, because using RxJS in anything but Angular is a good exception, just because it's like first class RxJS all around, right? You got async pipe and all that cool stuff. A lot of other frameworks you have to write, you kind of have to do weird things. You have to deal with subjects and learn how not to abuse subjects, and there's all sorts of those sorts of things. And so redux-observable just makes that less likely that you're going to abuse that.
Yeah, that's a great introduction. I was wondering if we could, like, if you have some examples that you could show. Sure. on how to use that, because I think sure. Looking at the code is actually something that
totally
makes it more understandable. Yeah,
absolutely. So I'm going to share my screen here. All right, so if you can't see my screen, let me know. So this is let's start just on that redux-observable website. And as you'll notice, there's a little note here I put in there. So it's pretty straightforward as a library. Like, it's like a lot of things people like to point out about Redux itself, regular Redux, that like Redux itself could be implemented in like a handful of lines of code, right? So why use Redux? Well, you still want to use Redux because you can make the basics of Redux in a handful of lines of code, but all of the developer experience related stuff, like working with dev tools, error handling and checking and making sure that you're not, passing the wrong things, all of that stuff kind of adds up, and eventually you just reinvent the wheel. Redux-observable is a similar type of thing. It's really not that complicated of code to implement Redux-observable, but there's a bunch of niceties so we would recommend you use it at least. But that being said, because it's so simple, it's pretty much in maintenance mode. There has not been, since 2.0, there has not actually been a whole lot of changes. And it's not because people are, asking, oh, we need major changes and major new things. We've kept the scope pretty small and deferred to, RxJS normal patterns for a vast majority of things. So keep that in mind. I do still, make sure that there's no issues and bugs and stuff like that, but for the most part it's pretty stable. So let's go over to the basics and just get a kind of an understanding of this. Hopefully this is not too small to see. I don't know if I can. I can. Oh no, I guess I can't. I was going to see if I could collapse that, but the gist, I'm going to copy this over to editor, that way I can see this a little better. So the gist of what an epic is, if you're familiar with TypeScript, and if you're not, it's okay, I'll explain it another way. But if you're familiar with TypeScript, an epic has this type signature. You get two arguments. The first one is the stream of action. So it's an observable where the type, the values flowing through the observable is a Redux action, whatever that Redux action is. And then you get second argument, which is a stream of state updates. State observable is a custom Redux observable thing. It's like a behavior subject, except for there's just some subtle differences. The main important thing is that I think I have state observable somewhere here. No, I guess I don't. But the main thing is that it is you can either subscribe to it. Whoops, I'll just do this. You can either subscribe to it directly, right, or pipe it and do all your normal stuff. Or on the other hand, it also has the .value property on it at every time. Kind of like that's what I meant by it's kind of like a behavior subject. So if you had some code, like let's start writing a simple epic, like we'll say fetch pancakes epic. And then we'll say state, and then we'll do this. So like a normal epic might look like this. Like you'd say filter action type is fetch pancakes. And let's actually do this with the newer versions of RxJS. And then let's say we're going to map that action to, just for now, we're actually just going to map this to another action called fetch pancakes success. And what convention you use on this, I'm not advocating for some particular convention as far as the Redux side of things. Those patterns are constantly evolving. I would definitely just rely on the Redux documentation rather than what I'm doing. But let's say pancakes 1, 2, 3, right? So this is a very simple epic that's really contrived and is stupid. Like basically you'd never do this, but we've got your stream of actions. We're piping that through and filtering all those actions. And once we see an action that was dispatched called fetch pancakes, we're mapping that into fetch pancake success. Now, one thing that trips people up about this is you have to think of epics as running as like sidecars. Like they're not running. So how do I say this? When an action is dispatched through Redux, redux-observable does not give you the ability to prevent that action from reaching your reducers. It will always reach your reducers no matter what. In fact, the action has already reached your reducers by the time you see it within the epic. So at this point, if fetch pancakes had changed the state in the Redux store in some way, you actually can observe that. So something, it might be state.value whatever, right? There's might be something in the Redux store called whatever. You actually have access to that synchronously on this state observable. So when I say you're mapping this action into another action, you're not preventing this action from reaching the store, the reducer. You're basically dispatching a new action. Now, if I had done something like ignore elements, which is like a Redux or RxJS operator for just basically dropping everything, then nothing would happen, right? If I haven't let's say this never happens, like if I have some action type that never actually is dispatched, then this epic is basically meaningless. It never dispatches anything because see how you're returning an observable. It's an observable of actions in and an observable of actions out. And so you use filter a lot. Now, because filter boilerplate is kind of boilerplatey, what folks usually use is we have a custom operator of type, which is it's really simple, but it does cut down on some boilerplate for you, where you can say of type and then pass in the types that you want to. So it could be like multiple types if you wanted to, but by and large, people just use one type, right? So and this the nice thing is that this is an example where both NGRX effects and redux-observable use the exact same conventions and features. So this is one-to-one convertible between the two. So yeah, so we say of type fetch pancakes, and then so let's do something a little bit more realistic. So switch map, and all of these operators, I'm going to assume that the person watching has RxJS experience or has figured it out, and if not, that you'll definitely want to learn RxJS before you dive into this, because otherwise it's going to get like super hairy. So like I'm not importing these operators, which I should be, of course. So like this would come from RxJS, right? Or if you're using an older version of it, it would be under operators. So switch map, we're going to switch map this into, like, let's say, from fetch or whatever, and we go to some place. I'm not going to, I guess I could do it. It's not going to be that hard. So response, JSON, pipe that, map that. Then we'll say map the result of that, switch map. Because basically I'm taking advantage of the from fetch RxJS thing, and then this returns a promise, and switch map is able to, I could have used merge map, it doesn't matter. It's able to, you can return any kind of stream-like thing. It could be an array, it could be an observable, it could be a promise, anything that could be kind of treated as a stream by RxJS can be returned. And so I'm just kind of using that. So we'll say JSON, and then from there, just to make things a little bit more explicit, I'm going to use a real return statement. From here, we could then take that JSON, and it might be like result, it might be like type, we've got that fetch pancakes, success, and we have the payload, and we'll say JSON or something like that. Like this might be a this is a very contrived, simple example where I'm fetching the pancakes, going over to some API, and we'll just call that pancakes, and getting the data back, and then and I might have a typo here. It's been a hot second since I've used from fetch. Lately, I've been dealing with other things. I've been writing a lot of RxJS lately, but this is the general gist. And so this, like I pointed out, I know I'm kind of a broken record, but if this is all the code you're ever going to write is input, fetch, output, I really would advise against using redux-observable or NGRX effects or anything of those things, just because it's a lot of boilerplate for something that you could do very simply. But let's take a look at some more complicated examples. So we've got all of these examples I've been kind of running through. Those are here. Here's the very simple hello world where you're mapping ping epic, you're mapping pings to pong. And we go through all that stuff here. You could delay it by 1,000 milliseconds. And once that action will then go through your reducer. So there's a very similar one. This is kind of the older version of the fetch utilities. Now we support from fetch. I'd actually recommend using that instead. Yeah, so let me find the example we've got. More complicated examples. I thought we added it here, but maybe we didn't. So let me go to, got a video on YouTube that kind of was a long time ago, 2016, back when I showed this for the first time. There's a kind of an interesting example. Oh, it's going to be hard to see that. Yeah, it's going to be hard to see that. But if you can see it by chance, I'll just very quickly talk about it. This is the stock ticker example where this is where it really starts to shine if you're doing WebSockets or anything that really needs to be stream-like and has multiple points of coordination and cancellation and retrying and error handling. Basically, the same reasons RxJS can really shine on complicated async problems, redux-observable also, just makes that easier to deal with Redux. So I'm trying to wonder if there is a way. Let me stop sharing here for a second and see if I can find.
Chris, any questions so far?
Yeah, please. And interrupt me at any moment. I no problem.
Oh, you're muted, Chris.
That always happens.
Exactly. Yes, it does.
Yeah, it's definitely looks a lot of like NGRX, and I think it's good to mention that, at least that's how I understand it, that epics, you can think of epics like parallel streams that happen outside of your main Redux loop, and
Absolutely.
I think that makes a good visualization of how things happen, and that we are actually we are actually going out of the main loop, but we are not stopping the main loop, as you've mentioned. So
Right.
everything that enters the loop is like actually going through the reducers, and then everything that comes out of the streams that you return will also reach the reducers back and possibly back to, I think, back to other epics.
Exactly. Yeah, you can epics can I like to, so sometimes this trips people up, but I like to think mentally as an epic is almost like a separate process or like some sort of green thread sort of thing. It does not run in a different thread, just to be very clear. But mentally you can kind of think of it as that way because it's pub sub, right? You get input messages and then you can send messages output. But that should be the only way in which that epic communicates with the outside world, other than like side effects, right? Like leaving the like fetching and WebSockets and stuff like that. You shouldn't have like any other sort of like you shouldn't pass in a callback through and have like through an action and have it invoke a callback or something like that. You really need to treat them as kind of separate pieces of execution that communicate through the world through actions, inputs and outputs. So I did find that stock ticker example code that I had posted. This is the old gist 5 years ago. So there's a bunch of things that have changed since then. So RxJS, for example, has switched to the pipeable operators rather than prototype, but it's pretty easy mentally to kind of convert that in your head that like, this is just convert this to the pipeable version. So here you can see we've got the WebSocket stream. We have this start ticker stream. When that gets kicked off, we're going to merge map that to a multiplexed WebSocket. So the WebSocket helper that RxJS comes with has built-in support for doing multiplexing, which is a word that comes. It's basically means multiple channels of bidirectional communication over the same transport, if that makes sense. So in this case, it's meaning that like we're sending and receiving messages over a single WebSocket, but with different independent subscriptions. Like, so as soon as you say, oh, I want to listen for the Netflix stock, the server is going to start sending you messages about the Netflix stock. But you can also say, hey, I want messages about the Google stock, and it will also start sending you messages about Google stock concurrently over the same stream. And so you need a way to kind of filter and coordinate that, and the multiplex helper helps solve that sort of thing. And I talk about this a little bit more in the talk if you want to watch that, but this is how we can filter out that aren't related to this particular ticker that is looking for. And because it's RxJS, we get retrying for free, like in a very simple way. We can do, here we can check if we're online or not. And if we are, we're going to try again in a second. Otherwise, we're going to wait until we come back online. And this is, this is a great example of, it might be difficult to understand when you first, or how do I say this? It might be, you'd have no idea that this is the syntax and this is what you would use when you first start writing it. Just like when you start learning a programming language or a framework, you don't really know what to do until you read the documentation or someone teaches you. But once you do, it becomes really handy because you can do like exponential backoff, for example, is really trivial to do here if we wanted to do that. RxJS just makes it that much easier. And then here we got the take until, which is for cancellation. So when we receive a particular, closed ticker stream and it is the same one that we're multiplexing for, we're going to cancel that particular stream, and it only cancels that particular multiplexed one, not all of them. And so if you wanted to write this same amount of code without RxJS, it would be a lot more complicated. It's totally doable. Not saying one's better than the other per se, but if you already know RxJS or it's something that you enjoy doing and your team enjoys it, that's the other thing, that it can be really great to go that way. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and I don't think it's really super important to get into, but there's, simple stuff is like error handling, right? You can choose to, you have your catch error operators. You can put them in here so that you don't have the epic, stop listening for actions. There's also dependency injection. Why is that not loading? There we go. There is a basic dependency injection mechanism, which is the third argument to the epic. You don't have to use this. You can use any sort of feature you wanted, but this was a commonly asked for thing, so we did add it in case you want to use it. It's pretty straightforward. As far as writing tests go, if you have not already learned the RxJS test scheduler, I'd really recommend that. So there is let's see, don't lose your marbles. There's definitely a talk on it. I know it exists.
It's fun struggling to find your.
There we go. All right.
You.
Yeah. So, and I can share. I don't know if you guys share links, but I can also give you guys links about this later. But I did it at RxJS Live conference in London. It was remote at the time because of pandemic, but I gave a talk starting from the very basics. So like if you have no idea what the test scheduler is in RxJS and no idea what marble diagrams are, you're going to learn all of that and pretty in-depthly, I think, because this is like the first time I've had 30 whole minutes to be able to talk about that specifically. So it'll be very useful to watch that and get kind of a crash course with visualizations, because that's the other thing that I think is hard, is just reading documentation on it. Although it's good documentation, it's not as visual and it doesn't show you animations and stuff like that like I'm able to do. So but the gist is that you're able to test these epics in a much easier synchronous way, especially if they have to deal with lots of async problems. Testing async things are just such a pain in the butt. They can be non-deterministic and flaky, or take a long time, and it complicated on how you like mock out certain things. So the test scheduler's goal is to try and make that easier, but it comes at the expense of learning another domain, right? It's a very specific thing. So you have to learn marble diagrams. Yeah, I think that's the high level. I mean, I don't think there's a good point in like walking through the documentation or something like that. But that's redux-observable at a high level. I've seen lots of people use it very successfully, and I've also seen lots of people use it unsuccessfully because of the things I was warning about. It's just I gotta stress that not to. It's really shiny and cool, but don't use it just to use it. That's the thing I have to stress.
Yes, I guess we can say that if you are already using Redux for a good reason, then
great.
Then using Redux observables might be a good idea. I've been actually struggling to find a good alternative a couple of months ago to suggest to a friend of mine. And because I come from a mindset of Angular, and it's hard to sometimes to switch to the React world, and having some model that actually resonates with an Angular developer is nice. I think I'm saying Angular too much for a React talk.
No, I think there'll be a lot of people who watch this who have a past life in Angular, or in a current life in Angular, and they're trying to migrate. And hooks are like React hooks are one of those things where you usually either love it or you hate it, and like it's very different, and there are caveats with it, just like there are caveats with the class-based React components. If you wanted to, though, you could, using Redux and redux-observable is a third option, basically. Like you could choose to forego hooks, at least writing them yourself entirely, and you could just basically use React as almost a templating layer. And I've seen people do that as well. People who already know Redux, already know RxJS, and the team likes it and has no problem with it. They've decided, we're going to use that, and then the view layer becomes more hot swappable. Like it's not totally hot swappable, but the amount of lift to switch between Vue or React or whatever the new hotness is not as much of a lift if you were putting all of your side effect related stuff in redux-observable, and then your state management, business logic, and reducers. So there can be some benefit to that. But in the end, is that going to pay off? It depends on the team. Just be careful.
Yeah, I think it's always like dependent on people. Like I am the person who enjoys working with RxJS, and like putting myself like deep into like all of those operators, and also I like the separation of concerns and probably indirection as well. Like the view layer is where all the HTML and CSS happens, and the logic is here on the other side, and I can think of it in completely abstract terms. It doesn't have to even be aware of the React view layer.
Exactly, not at all. In fact, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Do you? You've mentioned that people were. You've seen people abusing patterns in RxJS. Can you? Do you have some like concise examples of how can it go bad? Because I
mean, I can give. So let me share my screen again and kind of just jot some ideas. So there's a lot of ways in which things can go bad with RxJS. I mean, this is not a unique. I don't want to pick on RxJS or redux-observable because it's not unique. I can talk all day blue in the face about abuse, like TypeScript, using TypeScript when you shouldn't, using immutable JS and those sorts of things when it's like overkill. Because I've helped. I think maybe I'm biased because I've spent several years mentoring other people, like even as my job, and so I've seen the worst of the worst patterns and the scenarios where someone was like, I'm a new developer, and so I'm going to learn TypeScript, I'm going to learn immutable JS, redux-observable, RxJS. I'm going to use all of these hot technologies all at the same time and learn them all at the same time. And I'm just like, and it was all just to basically fetch data and then display it. Like, it's like, oh, like you have to learn. I mean, if you enjoy it, like I have no argument with someone who's like, I'm doing this, even though I know it's overkill, I'm doing this so that I can learn for when it isn't overkill. Absolutely. Go to town. Those are fun. Like I do that all the time. I over engineer my own personal projects just to be able to learn and take advantage of those things. Just don't. Where I get upset, or not upset, I get disappointed is when, people are, get really frustrated and start blaming. They're like, oh, I hate TypeScript and I hate RxJS and I hate all of these things when they're doing it themselves. Like these tools are not, I have yet to meet a single library or tool that is a one size fits all sort of thing. And so you have to use discretion on, there's a cost associated with learning something. And the more, the more something is going to help you in the long run, usually the harder it is to get into it initially, if that makes sense. Like there's a payoff. And then eventually it starts to pay dividends. And that's kind of the whole point. It's like RxJS. RxJS is complicated to learn, but once you do learn it and you really truly learn it and not just get frustrated with it, it can pay dividends in the long run. And that's why the people who have gotten over that hill really are, a lot of them are almost like Haskellers, where it's like they preach about how great it is, and the people on the outside are like looking at this going, how can anyone think this is great? This is terrible. Like, who are these people? It's the same type of thing. I think that's actually a really good analogy. Is just that any time that like something has a steep learning curve but a really great long-term payoff with dividends, that you're gonna get a very vocal community that talks about the very different dichotomy between the community who's actually in it and the people who are not. So anyway, so like giving some examples of like the worst, like don't do this sort of thing. I'm just going to not worry about naming and stuff like that. But so let's say that you've got an epic here and you pipe this into something. I'm not going to worry about naming. So let's say switch map, and let's say, like, I'll give you some really, so the first example I gave you actually really, like, it's fine to have this code if you really are okay with it. But if you are hesitant and you're new to RxJS and you're new to Redux and stuff like that, if this is all you're going to do is action in, fetch, action out, again, I would recommend against. So I wouldn't say this is an abuse of it, but because it's not, it's an overkill if this is all you're going to do. Where there are I'm going to now talk about things that are true abuses, in the sense of you should have no reason why you ever do this. You should not do this. But I have unfortunately seen it, because people will, so it's hard to speculate why. But so like one thing I've seen is like people will have some sort of callback, right? Like they'll actually put functions on actions and then invoke them. And maybe this is like an action. So like, let's say that you had your store. I'm just going to use pseudocode here. So we got your store and you dispatch and you say something, and then you say callback, value, and then do stuff with it, right? It doesn't matter what it is. Like it could be like set state or something. Whoops. Whatever. Like this is pseudocode, right? But the point being, in whatever framework you're using, somehow you dispatch to the store the type, and people sometimes put callbacks on that and then do set state and stuff like that. While there are circumstances where this works, there are lots of circumstances where this does not work. And in fact, the Redux actions, this is less about a redux-observable thing and more about a Redux thing in general, that redux-observable makes it more tempting to do, which is that actions themselves, unless you have some sort of middleware that's handling it, actions themselves should be serializable. That way the dev tools are able to replay them, and that you don't have to deal with the identity problem of like every function you have. When you have a function like a callback, it captures the local environment. Like by definition, like here we're capturing this variable or whatever this is in that scope. And so it's not a replayable thing, because if you're between, like the worst would be through hooks. Like if you were using hooks and then doing this, oh God, you can have all sorts of problems, because now hooks, it's so hard to explain. And that's exactly why I am so worried about that sort of scenario. And it's because like there's the stale, I don't know what that people actually call it, but I call it kind of the stale closure problem with hooks. And that's that hooks makes the assumption that like every time you re-render that component, you're going to throw away all of the closures for the most part, except for in cases where it doesn't matter. And so if you don't do that, if you actually capture a closure and give it to some outside thing, they can invoke that. When I say closure, I mean a function which closes over the environment, like some environment variable. So if it's able to invoke that, it can get access to, like, this is probably it's probably too abstract for folks to really grok it. So I'm just going to make some additional pseudocode. So let's say, whatever, and then set whatever, use state. So if you start saying set whatever, like in this very specific case, this is technically fine in the sense here. Let me make this a little bit more realistic. It's still pseudocode, so don't bear with me, but trying to make it a little less abstract. Okay, so in this case, we've got the whatever component, use state, set state, whatever. And then, we've got button on click. And so when you click that button, we're gonna somehow, let's say somehow we have this store, doesn't matter how we got it, we dispatch an action, and we've got this callback that we're passing in. Well, we're closing over this set whatever. So if we did something like, here's an example of what is the value of whatever here. Well, yeah, it's actually really hard to predict what the value will be, because this has a reference to this callback. It can call it at any moment. Like your code could do something really, really, really nasty. I mean, this is obviously contrived, but you could do something like this, right? 5 seconds later, I'm going to call this back, right? And so the value of whatever could be anything. I mean, like who knows what it could have been? You could have other code that has changed this value.
Could have rendered hundreds of times and changed the value over time.
Yeah, and so I mean, there are patterns. If you're really a React whiz, or you really there are patterns to solve this. Like, I wouldn't say solve this, to work around this in some scenarios. Like in this very specific scenario, you can work around this by passing a callback to the setter. React supports that. And when you do that, now the value of whatever is going to truly be the correct latest value of whatever it is. It's kind of like a, React knows that might be a pattern that you abuse and get into and sometimes need just for practicality reasons. So they give you that. But I would say I have heard a lot of people use this as an excuse. Like they've said, oh, well, we have this, so it's no big deal. Unless you use this every time, meaning you never once ever rely on the outer variable, I think it's difficult. Like, so what, I'll give you an example. So what if you set something else, like, forgive me for how contrived it is, but let's say that you want to set something else that's value plus whatever, right? This is a case where you're not actually wanting to set whatever, you just want to use whatever is. However, this could be wrong. So then you got to do weird things like this is, I've seen this before, and I get it. I've seen it enough times where I'm like, okay, I know what you're doing here and why you're doing it. But like chances of someone coming in here and screwing this up later are high. And what it's doing is basically abusing the fact that you can call set whatever with the callback to get the true latest value. And then from there, you can return the existing value so that it doesn't actually change. Like, and that, like, obviously if I went like this, now all of a sudden it's broken. Actually, I don't know. It's a good question of whether React ignores returning undefined. I would guess it does not, because I don't know how it could ignore it. But the point being, and then there's all sorts of like, it's such a hard thing to talk about succinctly on a video, because there's all sorts of caveats even to this example. Like I could argue, why are you using this pattern instead? Why aren't you using use memo or whatever, or deriving the state, elsewhere? But I'm trying to get basically a short, succinct, non-complicated way. The real worry is when things actually do get complicated, and then it's just hard to kind of grok that. So that's, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but that was one common thing, is putting things in actions that, creating some sort of communication channel between your component and the epic that is not serializable, or another one might be passing a promise. So like you wouldn't want to pass a promise or pass any sort of callback or anything that's not serializable, basically, between the two.
Yeah. And I want to call out that we only have 5 more minutes left.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, sometimes I get going.
Which is awesome.
Yeah. But yeah, I can share the links with some of the stuff I've talked about, and you guys can share that. Any other thoughts? I feel like I can't do the call without like playing the Dragon Dagger or something. I don't even know if I have batteries in this thing. Let's see if I have batteries. I don't even know how to turn it on. Oh, there we go.
It looks like a Power Rangers thing, is it not?
It is actually Power Rangers.
Okay.
Yeah, and I don't have batteries in it. I took the batteries out because I didn't want them to explode. But it does. It's like, remember, if you look like you're my age, whoever's watching this, you probably remember this, because this was, my generation. I had this toy as a kid, and then one of my friends stole it from me, like in school, like from me. And so my friend Ben, bought this for me for my birthday once, and it was very, very happy. It was very thoughtful. It was very thoughtful.
Well, Chris, what are your thoughts? Where do we go from here?
I feel like there's so much to unravel still, but I think we need to keep it concise.
Yeah.
I think we can give some more examples in the description section below. Later.
Yeah, absolutely. And if folks, I don't know if you guys keep comments open, but if comments are open, people can post about specific things, and if there's enough interest, we can do a follow-up and touch on some specifics.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I appreciate you coming, Jay. Thanks so much for taking some time. We'll probably do like another thing, so stay tuned, everybody. But you can follow Jay on Twitter. He helps people. Yeah. As JP helps. So feel free to do that. And then Chris can be found on Twitter as well. Or if you want to find me on Twitter, you can find all of us and come hang out, have a little chat about RxJS, redux-observable, and all the things. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.